Bienvenidas, bienvenidos a esta mesa de Muro a Muro, un foro que forma parte de Fil Pensamiento, que en esta edición de 2024 decidimos dedicar a abordar el tema de la democracia, aún sabiendo que la democracia, que la palabra democracia se convierte por un lado, en un significante vacío casi, y por el otro lado es un concepto cada vez más impopular. Vamos a hablar de ciudadanía en lugar de hablar de democracia, y para hacerlo tenemos invitados a Gary Gerstle, doctor por la Universidad de Harvard, profesor emérito y director de investigación sobre historia de Estados Unidos en la Universidad de Cambridge y colaborador frecuente de The Guardian y Atlantic Monthly, y en algún momento ya participante en De Muro a Muro. Gary ha escrito una docena de libros sobre la historia de las instituciones políticas, los movimientos sociales, la política económica, las migraciones en la historia de Estados Unidos y sobre el papel que todo esto ha jugado en la conformación de la identidad estadounidense y de su democracia. Su más reciente libro, Auge y Caída del Orden Neoliberal, un libro que ya alguien ha clasificado como un clásico instantáneo, se encuentra ya en español, editado por Península. John Keane es un australiano formado en universidades de Adelaide, Toronto y Cambridge, y es catedrático en teoría política de la Universidad de Sydney, desde donde mantiene una intensa actividad académica internacional. En 1989 fundó el Centro para el Estudio de la Democracia, el tema central de su trabajo, reflejado en más de una veintena de libros que lo colocan como uno de los analistas más relevantes e influyentes en el mundo en el tema de la democracia. El más reciente de ellos, China's Galaxy Empire, recién salió este año, y podemos leer varios de sus libros traducidos al español, en especial en el Fondo Cultura Económica, y colaboraciones que aparecen en Letras Libres, en la revista Letras Libres. Kristen Collins es doctora por la Universidad de Georgetown con una tesis sobre el ver y el ser visto en la política contemporánea. Kristen es una teórica de la política que trabaja en el programa Hayek para estudios avanzados en filosofía, política y economía en el Mercator Center de la Universidad de George Mason. En sus propias palabras, su trabajo es una síntesis de historia del pensamiento político y económico con la teoría contemporánea sobre la democracia, desde donde trabaja temas relacionados con democracia de audiencias, dinámicas políticas de la vigilancia, ética y política de la tecnología, que se reflejan, por cierto, en el podcast Virtual Sentiments que ella conduce, y que es interesantísimo. Pues bienvenidos los tres, mil gracias por estar con nosotros. Y sin más, quisiera que arrancáramos la conversación con el tema que originó nuestra discusión, de a qué dedicábamos esta edición de Muro a Muro, que era a abordar por qué la democracia está en este estado de descrédito, y de ser un significante casi vacío. Gary, quisiera comenzar tú, por favor.
Well, that's a small question. First, let me say I'm honored to partake of this discussion. I had the privilege of participating in person at the Guadalajara Book Fair. I think it was 7 years ago now, and it was a very special experience. I enjoyed it a great deal, learned a lot. My only sorrow now is that participating from afar, we can't interact directly with those who will be at Guadalajara in a few weeks. But I wanted to send a message to all of you listening to this that very grateful for the opportunity to discuss very important issues that have national roots, but also have global implications. When did democracy become so unpopular? When did it become an empty word? I actually am not sure of the answer to that question, except let me acknowledge that I think democracy is in deep crisis in many areas of the world. And for me, if I'm to locate a point of origin, it is the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. which leads me to think that we are in somewhere between 15 and 20 years of democracy not working very well. Of course, when one speaks about the globe, the spread of democracy and the functioning of democracy has always been uneven. And perhaps what characterizes this moment is a loss of confidence in so many places in the world that democracy can lead people, citizens, societies to a better future. My starting point for understanding this is first to understand the power of neoliberalism, an ideology that preached freeing capitalism from all constraints. This is an ideology that had been in the works for decades, but became hegemonic in the 1990s after the fall of communism. And communism not only discredited communism itself, but I would argue also discredited various forms of socialism, various forms of state regulation of the economy, social democracy, leading to an enthusiasm for freeing capitalism from virtually all forms of government control, in the belief that this would lead to the best possible future. Neoliberalism aspired to be a global system. Everywhere, economies were to be driven by free market principles with little regulation. In this world of the 1990s and first decade of the 21st century, private corporations in this global world aspired to increase their global reach, becoming ever more powerful and transcending ever more the kind of constraints that nation states had been able to place on private industry, capitalist development. This was going on everywhere. And one of the characteristics of this moment was the ability of private power, private corporate power, to outstrip the ability of nation states, democratic or otherwise, to regulate them in a meaningful way. The ideology of neoliberalism acknowledged that this system increased inequality in the world, but also made the further argument that that inequality in economic terms and political terms wouldn't matter that much, because the energy released by freeing capitalism from constraints would lead to such rapid economic development, the generation of so much economic growth, the generation of abundance everywhere in the world, that the inequality in economic terms and the lack of control in political terms wouldn't matter all that much, because in one of the mottos of that era, all boats would rise. The rich would get immensely richer, but the poor would escape their poverty into a kind of secure and meaningful middle-class existence. And so the inequality that was deepening and prevailing wouldn't matter all that much. And for a time, I think this ideology was so hegemonic that it carried the day, and it carried the day until the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009. There's no time now to go into the details of that crisis. We can get into it later. I think it's fading from memory somewhat because it now was a long time ago, more than 15 years ago. That crisis was driven by banking practices and financial institutions among the most powerful institutions of the world that have been effectively freed from meaningful public state regulation. And the practices engaged in by banks pushed the world to the edge of what some commentators have called financial Armageddon. I think the days of September 2008 were among the most dangerous in the world, arguably as dangerous as the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis in the early 60s, because the world was at the edge of complete financial collapse. The entire financial system of the entire globe seizing up, ceasing to function. Some economists think that we were within days of that actually occurring. If that had occurred, that moment would have become the worst economic calamity in the history of the modern world, probably outstripping the calamity of the Great Depression of the 1930s. That crisis was averted. The depths of the crisis was averted, but the pattern of recovery exposed the inequality of the neoliberal system, because the first efforts of states almost everywhere was to save the banks that had caused the crisis in the first place. Financial stability was the motto of the time. Put the banking system in order, everything else will take care of itself. And the carnage that was caused by the financial crisis, the loss of jobs, the loss of income, the forfeiture of one's own real estate, and I'm not talking about commercial real estate, but one's home, one's private property, the scale of the crisis was colossal. And if you were in a position in the world where you owned equities, or you were invested in banks, or you had financial assets, you had recovered by this calamity by 2010, 2011. If you did not have assets in financial markets, the crisis went on for you for really another 10 years. And in this moment in which banks were perceived to have caused the financial crisis, and then it was perceived that governments were doing their best to bail out these financial institutions first, it's at this point that the inequality of the neoliberal system became, for a lot of people in many countries, unbearable and intolerable. And the critique was not just of private centers of power. The critique was also a critique of states, of governments, for being so invested in those who were already privileged, so as to increase their privilege at a time of economic crisis and a time of economic calamity. And the sentiment began to spread that these states and governments were so beholden to private corporate interests that they had ceased to function in a meaningful way to serve ordinary citizens. And this critique of governments went across the political spectrum. It was a critique of authoritarian governments, but it also became a critique of democratic governments. And in the decade after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, one sees populist explosions understood as explosions at politics as it was normally being done, even in democratic societies, explosions of anger and cries that political systems were no longer responding to the needs of ordinary citizens, no longer taking their needs into account. And if we look at where these populist explosions occurred, the Tea Party in the United States, Orban rising to power in Hungary, Modi rising to power in India, Trump rising to power in the United States in 2016, Brexit withdrawing Britain from the EU, which I consider to be a populist explosion fitting into this, the rise to power of Bolsonaro in Brazil in 2019. You have this condensed decade of populist explosions in almost every corner of the world. And those populist explosions were a cry for help and a denunciation of politics as usual. And the critique of politics as usual fell as heavily on democratic states as any other states in the global system. And it's at this moment where I think the crisis of democracy really took root, a crisis that we still inhabit. One of the mysteries of this moment, and here this is my final thought, and I will cede the floor to my good colleagues. One of the mysteries of this moment is why populism of the right has been so much more powerful than populism of the left. There are some exceptions to this, of course, But if we look at the origins of the populist fury in the United States, the Tea Party uprising on the right came first, but immediately after that came Occupy Wall Street, which was a populism of the left. And there were many international echoes of that in various places in Latin America and Europe in the next few years. But if we look at and that culminated in the United States in the rise of Bernie Sanders, who was a very powerful presence in the United States in 2016. But if we look at the entirety of the decade, I think the populist explosion on the right has been a more powerful force than the populist explosion on the left. And that is a matter that I have been thinking a lot about, for which I don't have a clear and evident answer. So I leave this panel at this moment with that question to ponder some more. And I look forward to the other panelists and then the conversation that the four of us will have.
Gracias, Gary. John, ¿cómo ves tú este vacío del término democracia y esta pérdida de popularidad de la democracia?
Buenos días, buenas tardes, everybody. I'm very honored to be here with Marco and also Kristen and Gary. I wanted to say, sadly, that Nicolás Alvarado is not with us, and I wish him a very speedy recovery. I had been asked to speak about democracy as a four-letter word. Perhaps it's lost in translation. This is a bit different than an empty word. And I wanted to make several points, beginning with the important, often overlooked point that the word democracy is, of course, associated with a family of terms. And language, when it comes to speaking about democracy, is very important. I mean, the history of democracy shows that it undergoes important alterations of meaning. And this principle, let's say, of Wittgenstein, that, words matter, but they're contextual and they take their meaning from usage, applies to this phrase, four-letter word. I thought about this phrase, four-letter word, and discovered or became aware that, for example, context matters. In Chinese, 三字经, in Chinese, you speak about a three-letter word, not a four-letter word. And in French, un mot de cinq lettres, you speak about five letters. In German, I know that you speak about, let's say, setzen uns auf unsere vier Buchstaben. Let's sit down on our four-letter words. So, I mean, the very phrase, four-letter word, has its context dependent. And in English, it has an interesting history in which it has become a kind of signifier to describe, in slang, monosyllables, and that are linked to excretion and sex and genitals and blasphemy and notions of hell and damnation. A four-letter word is not a particularly attractive word, and there are jokes in English made, like the American joke that, have you ever noticed how many politicians have names with just four-letter words? Ford, Dole, Bush, Gore, and so on. It's on this first point about language mattering, and where I think we should have a discussion about the meaning of democracy and its history, that the first point is that, this democracy is a four-letter word, or has become a four-letter word that generates passionate outbursts where fingers are raised and the word itself, the phenomenon of democracy, is denounced. And there are very good reasons for this. Gary has correctly, in my view, emphasized the crisis tendency of actually existing democracies. My own view is that we are certainly living in troubled times. I do not think that the troubles that have descended on the House of Democracy are repetitions of the 1920s and 30s. This is a discussion we can have. I think instead that we are living in a period where actually it is not just the problem of banks, of the financialization of capitalism and the damaging effects on democracy, but it seems to me that we're living in a period in which practically every actually existing democracy is entangled in a multiplicity of trends. I mean, the troubles that democracy are facing are overdetermined, or if you were a quantum thinker, you would say that democracy is caught up in a kind of superpositioning of trends that are raising serious questions about the functional capacities of democracy and the normative desirability of democracy. What are these trends? Well, Gary has already mentioned the problem of neoliberalism. We could learn a lot about the troubles in the House of Democracy by rereading, for instance, Karl Polanyi's Great Transformation. And Karl Polanyi, the Hungarian political economist and historian, pointed out that when commodification processes, when the privatization of property and social relations unfolds without restriction, it produces great inequalities, social inequalities that are anathema to democracy, because after all, in one minimal sense, democracy is a kind of vision of a society where there are equalizing trends. The first trend, which Gary has emphasized, in one in which the gaps between rich and poor grow dramatically. Think of Elon Musk as a kind of male, signifier of this decadence. This neoliberalism in the last 45 years has created an angry underclass. The Yellow Vests protest in France, for instance. It has produced among the middle classes, including in the United States, a kind of ressentiment. This is a special French word to describe not just anger and envy, but a real and an intense dislike of a social dynamic, which is the soil in which demagogues appear. And Gary has mentioned this trend, and this neoliberalism is producing, I would say, the widespread feeling that democracy is a kind of mask. It's a kind of camouflage for rule by the rich oligarchs, and it is a kind of camouflage of citizen disempowerment. This is one very major trend. I think that there are a handful of trends, and the second I want to just mention briefly is the privatization of parties and elections. I mean, the end of what Otto Kirchheimer called the catch-all party. Elections in many contexts, India and the United States, are corrupted by huge quantities of money. In the book that I've written with my colleague Debasish Roy Chowdhury, we coined the phrase cremocracy. This is an original Greek word to describe the way that elections are kind of, they're processes where money speaks, and where money becomes the primary determinant of, or a primary determinant of, outcomes. And this second trend, the breakup and disintegration of the catch-all party system, is of course producing great quantities of disaffection, dislike of politics, dislike of politicians, and disaffection, including especially among the young. In the most recent European Union elections, only 10% of young people aged 18 who were eligible to vote actually came out to vote. This is a very worrying trend. Third trend, there is, I think, a developing sense that democracy, broadly and loosely defined, is impotent in the face of not only market failures of the kind that Gary has described, but it's a system of government and rule that does not address the growing problem of statelessness of millions of people, that the question of homelessness of millions of people globally is not addressed, or, for instance, that democracy is incapable of dealing effectively and rapidly with developments like species extinction and so-called climate change. Fourth trend in this convergence of trends is the rise of what I've called new despotisms. I mean, Russia, Saudi, Iran, China. I mean, growing numbers of polities that like to describe themselves as democracies. They are phantom democracies. They're top-down systems of power that actually have the ability to win sufficient support to be stable. They are unlikely to collapse. The expectation that Putin's Russia would collapse with American military pressure turns out to be folly. The point of these new despotisms is, of course, that they are serious alternatives to power-sharing constitutional democracy. We could talk about these new despotisms, and central in this process is, it's my most recent book, is the so-called rise of China. What we're witnessing is the emergence of a global empire of a kind we've never seen before, and it is outflanking the United States on all kinds of fronts, and its modus operandi at home is not describable in American liberal democratic terms. Of course, the Chinese Communist Party insists that China is a form of democracy which is superior to that of the United States. And finally, in this set of overdetermined trends, I think that it's a point not very often discussed, but in the history of democracy, there were three democratic empires. That is, empires that touted themselves as democratic. Imperial Athens, revolutionary France, aux armes citoyens, and the United States. In the most simple sense, there is a problem with the phrase democratic empire because you could see this as oxymoronic. You know, if an empire is extended rule of a polity over millions of people who live at vast distances from the center of the empire. It's true that empires gave birth to democratic experiments. The British Empire certainly did that. The Nazi Empire did not. But I'm very struck by the way that it seems to me this is the fifth trend and needs lots of discussion. There is a developing sense that predated October the 7th, but since October the 7th, there is a developing sense in various parts of the world that the American commitment to democracy is camouflage, it's hypocrisy, it's a polity that parades its credentials as democratic, but is actually having ruinous effects on the ideals of democracy. Why? Well, to put it very crudely, I would say that Harold Pinter, the English playwright, once remarked that, you know, if you boil it down, American foreign policy is kiss our ass, or else we will kick your head in. I mean, this is blunt language to describe, I would say, the feelings that the so-called rule of law order, or the rules-based order, is disintegrating. And this is very bad news for the ideals of democracy. One last comment, if I may, Marco. I was asked to speak about four-letter words. So I'm going to probably surprise you by saying that there's another four-letter word that describes democracy and why it is that it is of continuing global importance. And that is its punk quality. Let me explain. If in this period that we're talking about, if we sample globally opinions about democracy, it has to be mentioned that there are contexts where there is no sense or a very limited sense among people that there is a crisis of democracy. For them, democracy simply means, it's not a philosophical matter, it means clean running water, it means sewage, it means roads, it's the provision of hospitals, it's the elimination of violence, as in Mexico. But it's in a period like this that it seems to me, it's my final point, that philosophical justifications of democracy are very important. The simple question is, what's so good about democracy? Well, the disappointing news, if you look at the history of justifications of democracy, is that I think almost all of them are now exhausted. Let me summarize. If you go back to ancient Greece, if you look at the Athenian democratic empire, and if you read the speeches, the poems, and the plays, you will find that the main justification of democracy is that democracy, demokratia, makes us militarily powerful and strong. This is a very strange justification, which George W. Bush himself revived. Or if you come forward to modern times of electoral democracy, you find justifications like utilitarianism, the greatest happiness, the greatest number. That's a property-based, market-based justification of democracy. Too bad for the minorities. And why is it that happiness is the main principle? This is, I think, unconvincing. You will find justifications in the modern world of democracy as God-given. And when you look at the texts, for example, in the anti-slavery movement, you will find it's typically a Protestant God. That's very bad news for Catholics and Jews and Muslims and others. You will find in the early modern period justifications of democracy that say Giuseppe Mazzini in Italy, that democracy is the principle of the nation. That the nation is a first principle, and the principle of the nation requires democracy, and democracy is the great ally of the nation. This is I think, in retrospect, very unconvincing. There is the view that history is on the side of democracy. Frank Fukuyama, tried to peddle that idea as if there's a teleology. Well, this has become unconvincing. Or finally, in this bag of broken justifications of democracy, there is the elementary view that democracy is good because it enables the people to rule. If you ask what is democracy, it's that the people rule. So we have here a tautology that actually doesn't have much meaning. I want to finish by suggesting that there is, however, a justification of democracy that doesn't rely on first principles like God or the nation, or utilitarianism, a justification of democracy that is connected to suspicion of arbitrary and the refusal of arbitrary power. Among my favorite authors of the past generation is the Irish man of letters, C.S. Lewis. In 1942, Lewis wrote an essay on democracy in very dark times when it looked as though democracy would not survive in substance or spirit. And he said, the history of past justifications of democracy is that it was supposed that people are good and wise, and that for this reason they are entitled to rule, and therefore, tyranny and aristocracy and so on are considered to be undesirable. And C.S. Lewis went on to say, the problem with that justification, that people are intelligent and they're wise and they have capacities for goodness, etc., this is not true, because there are moments, as C.S. Lewis remarked in those dark times, 1942, there are moments and there are contexts where the abuse of power, even in the name of democracy, produces catastrophic consequences. And so here's the punk. Here's the punk four-letter word. Democracy is a spirit, a form of life, a way of handling power, a set of institutions committed, of course, to the equalization of life chances. I would say in my work, increasingly, it is about the life chances of the biosphere in which humans dwell. That's a discussion we could have. It's committed to the equalization of life chances, and for this reason, arbitrary abuse of power, predatory power, is anathema to democracy. And if you think that this last sentence, if you think that this punk quality of democracy, that it has a fugitive quality, that it has that it's a troublemaking way of handling power, that it has a precautionary quality. If you doubt all of this, then the onus, I would say to our listeners and viewers, the onus is to define an alternative polity. It requires, to put it simply, a belief in good kings and queens. And I think that in this sense, the universal quality of democracy, the universal quality of its spirit and its substance, is that it casts doubt on that principle, that there can be good rulers who never make mistakes, who never submit to corruption, who always are capable of providing and implementing the best possible decisions to keep everybody happy and satisfied with life. This precautionary punk quality of democracy calls that into question. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, John. Kristen, por favor, tu turno. Tú abordas el tema de la democracia en este interés de relacionar el pensamiento clásico, digamos, o el largo plazo de reflexión sobre la democracia con estas realidades de democracias de audiencias, de vigilancia. Desde tu perspectiva, ¿cómo estás abordando este tema?
Awesome. Thank you so much. I want to thank all the organizers for the invitation to this conversation. I do really wish that I could be there in person and interact with everybody in person, but I'm still so honored to participate in this remote session. So yeah, I mean, to start off, I do want to kind of, before I get into surveillance, situate myself within Judith Shklar's later studies of American citizenship. Judith Shklar was a liberal thinker who's had a lot of influence on my work. And she argued when she was studying American history that different groups of Americans, when they fought for the right to vote, whether it was the original colonists rebelling against the crown or freedmen after the Civil War, or women, they understood that the vote wasn't just about being able to access political power and secure their interests, but it was also about accessing equal standing in their community, being seen as peers of their fellow Americans. So I think with the rise of the liberal movements, the idea that democracy is a four-letter word, we should be thinking about these other features of democratic life. It's not just about formal political participation, but it's also about these social dynamics that shape how we see ourselves in relation to each other, how we see ourselves in relation to the state, and what that relationship is between the state and private actors. And that means that we should be concerned with things like surveillance, not just from the state itself, but from private actors as well. And so audience democracy, the concept that I like to work with, is more of an analytical framing. And I think it's really useful and helpful for thinking about the dynamics that John and Gary were outlining. If not, I think it's compatible, doesn't necessarily answer all the questions that we're interested in. But Bernard Manon came up with this concept, and he published this in 1997. So it kind of predates some of the dynamics we're talking about here too, while kind of coming to be at around the same time in the second half of the 20th century. What the concept denotes is that in the US and other democracies, there was a decline over time from political parties being what influences who gets to be nominated for the president, for example, in the US. And it's less of a power exercised by party members, by party bosses, with the rise of the mass media. With communications technologies, with television, politicians could more easily develop these parasocial connections with voters without necessarily the party's permission or the party's support. And I think that this is something that we see in the US with Trump as an example. And so when we think about the way that politics has always been mediated by different technologies or also by institutions like parties, we can see today that now there are fundamentally different gatekeepers, different forms of mediation that shape the democratic contest. And so when it comes to something like the populist sentiment, this populist movement, it is to some degree in the name of democracy. It's in the name, though, of a very particular kind of representation, of expectation, of hope for these politicians who can stand for their voters, for the constituents in a strong, kind of embodied and identificatory way, which is very distinct from necessarily what we often think about with representation, but it's also not entirely new to our time as well. And so what I'm really interested in is not just that the people are watching their politicians on TV, communing with Trump in that kind of, first he was a reality TV star, now he has these exciting rallies that I can go to. It's also the idea that the people are themselves subject to surveillance. Again, often, at least especially for liberals, we think often of state surveillance. And actually, John Keane brought up empire, and surveillance is an issue in terms of imperial and international forms of surveillance as well. But what I'm particularly interested in is that the media that we use to have political discussions, to watch and understand the policies or the rhetoric of politicians are increasingly digital technologies. And these digital technologies are predicated on surveillance, on data collected about their users. So, for example, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which became revealed in 2018, was relating to the 2016 presidential election, where Meta users found out, or Facebook users at the time found out, that their data was being collected through a kind of personality quiz that a team working with the Trump campaign had used. And you didn't have to consent to this yourself. You didn't have to use this quiz yourself. It was if your friend used it, your data might be collected about you, and that could be used to micro-target users with the particular political ads that might be most appealing to them, whether it's to get them to actually go vote for Trump or just to stay home and make sure they don't vote for Clinton. And so this scandal, I think, revealed and really ignited the backlash against tech. But it was something brewing for a long time. And it does reveal something that's bigger than just a single company. It's bigger than just Meta. It's bigger than just Google. It has to do with the infrastructure of the entire digital political economy. And the reason why I think this is relevant for thinking about democracy is because I think a lot of users are either suspicious of companies or unclear about how they are being watched or tracked online. And they also have a sense of seeing companies able to have kind of proprietary rights, privacy rights over their data that they don't have access to, that they don't have the same type of rights. And that is just one of many things that we could look to where citizens might feel a sense of not just social inequality, but political inequality as well. That the rule of law being applied equally to all isn't the case anymore, including in democracies. But the other issue when we get to thinking about the digital political economy is that it's fundamentally a transnational, international phenomenon, and something where not just the companies that might be based in different countries have such incredible power over, but when states like the United States or when the European Union advance policies, these are going to have huge ramifications for citizens of other countries. And so this is why I think that these types of dialogues that we're having today from wall to wall and elsewhere are so essential, because we can't just be thinking in terms of the nation state. We have to be thinking in terms of these more transnational terms. And while I'm best qualified to speak to these American policies, I do want to show that we need to be learning from each other. We need to be paying attention to each other. And I think that to some degree, the fear of democracy here in the US is also, I think, something that we need to match with an optimism about democracy. Because something that really concerns me is that, and this was a new thought I had listening to John and Gary, and I don't think you necessarily dispute this, and then thinking about Shklar's kind of review of these different democratic moments in the US, it's disheartening to me that it seems like democracy has become a four-letter word only as soon as it has just begun to have any actual real meaning. It has finally come to after, I'm a political theorist, so I think in centuries, but it's only in the 20th century that the US really becomes a true liberal democracy. And we're still working towards those ideals. And so I'm not ready to give up on it yet either, even as I do want to know more about why it's become such a dirty word.
Gracias. Hay varios temas que detecto, pero quisiera comenzar con uno. Todos ustedes han hablado de una dimensión internacional, global, en relación con la democracia, y sin embargo sigue siendo un tema muy centrado en Estado-Nación. ¿Cómo abordamos esa relación Estado-Nación y una realidad tecnológica, y no nada más tecnológica, sino John, por ejemplo, habla de la vida y de los ecosistemas y del planeta. ¿Cómo resolvemos esa tensión entre una democracia que sigue muy atada en los Estados-Nación y que cada vez está más filtrada, digamos, o invadida por cuestiones internacionales, globales?
A couple of points response to this comment and question. The marriage of the idea of democracy and territorial nation states only really happens from the end of the 18th century and through the course of the 19th century. The Greek democracies, of which we're now aware, probably 100, did not think of a democracy in terms of categories like nation or territorially bounded state. So the marriage, if that's the right word, of democracy and the nation state is comparatively recent. And it's been a very unhappy marriage. In my own work, I have tried, as it were, to break the boundaries or the boundedness of thinking about democracy, to unleash its spirit and its substance, so that we can think about democracy across borders, for instance. Well, if you live within the EU, you understand that comment. But second remark about globalization, yes, I mentioned in passing that there is an ecological dimension, or a problem, if you like, that democracy is confronted with. And to put things very simply, my own view is that there is a problem with the inherited understanding of the word democracy as the self-government of people through their chosen representatives. Let's just work roughly with that. Notice the homocentrism of that understanding of democracy. And if you push me, I will say something outrageous like, democracy is the most anthropocentric political norm that humans have ever come up with. I mean, there are other political forms, like monarchy, for instance, where it was understood that there is a god and there is a monarch who restricts the human power to unleash itself, so to say, on the biosphere. And so the problem for me is that if we think in more global terms about democracy as a desirable ideal, then we have to deal with this anthropocentrism buried into the very people-centered notion of democracy. And the short version of the solution that I've proposed in recent works, and a new book is coming out early next year, is that we could think of democracy as a process of monitoring, of scrutinizing human power over the biosphere, for restraining that power. That democracy comes to mean the self-restraint of human power within the biosphere, and the extension of rights of representation to biomes. Now, it's true that rivers can't speak up for themselves in court, but what we're witnessing, I believe, and it's a positive trend, it belongs to my lifetime, is the greening of democracy, where democracy comes to host all kinds of networks and groups and organizations whose job is to scrutinize the predatory power of humans, to blow the whistle on the commodification of the biosphere, etc. And this bringing, as Bruno Latour, the French writer, would have said, this bringing of democracy back to earth is a very important condition of its survival and flourishing. And it may be that, understood in this way, democracy as about accountability, representation, restraint of abuse of power, it may be that democracy, it turns out, is a superior form for ensuring our survival and future generation survival on planet Earth.
First, let me say, Kristen, what you said about finding a way to be optimistic about democracy strikes me as incredibly important. And I hope before we're finished with our conversation today, we can dwell on that matter. I do think the democratic urge, and I think John feels this as well, I think the democratic urge is irrepressible in humanity. And even if democratic systems fail, the democratic urge will be reborn in future generations. But I hope we can talk somewhat about how to construct optimistic ways of going forward. I'm not a political theorist, I'm a historian, and so I'm focused on what seems possible in the world. And I want to take up John and Marco's point about the relationship of democracy to the nation state. I think, John, you said that it's been a very unhappy marriage, and I understand what you're saying, but I also would suggest that the most successful period of democracy in the modern world, and I don't know enough about the ancient world, has occurred precisely where nationalism and democracy has been married. That in its most pronounced form occurred in the North Atlantic world between the 1940s and the 1970s. And in terms of understanding this phenomenon, I always come back to a book that had and still has an enormous impact on me. It's Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities. Benedict Anderson was an anthropologist and political scientist of Southeast Asia, and always abhorred the forces of nationalism, wanted to eliminate nationalism from the world. He himself was a socialist, and then he confronts the phenomenon of Cambodia and Vietnam, two socialist societies that are not supposed to have any kind of national sentiment whatsoever, fighting each other to the death. And nothing in his Marxist or left background had prepared him for the power of nationalism and the kind of belonging that nationalism can elicit. And the question in that book that has always stayed with me and that I just want to throw out now is how is it that people die so much more easily for the nation than they do for Amnesty International? How is it that the death that nations can draw on from its people is so much more powerful than the call to humanitarianism and taking care of the earth and taking care of multiple species? And this led him to dwell on the power of the nation. And part of the power of the nation is, I think, it confers a kind of immortality. If we imagine ourselves as belonging to the United States or Italy or Mexico, we may die, but Mexico continues. I may die. I will die. The United States will continue. An Italian may die, or an Australian may die. But if one hooks oneself to the story of a nation, there's a promise of immortality there, and that promise of immortality becomes correspondingly more important in a world that is abandoning faith and a belief in God, which of course is the other way of addressing death and disappearance. There's a more practical way in which nations matter, and that is in the heyday of democracy in the global north, in the United States, in Britain, in France, in Germany, in Italy, national legislatures that could plausibly present themselves as rendering the people sovereign were successful in controlling private economic power and redistributing the fruits of private economic activity to enhance equality, to advance social democracy. These legislatures were thought to be the embodiment of the people's will in those particular countries, and they were understood to be effective. Successful transfer of power from one party to another. This is one of the tests of democracy, the rule of law. These were nations in which the people felt that they had an entity, the national legislature, in which their voice was ultimately the sovereign voice. And if you did not like what was being done in that national legislature, then you can throw the bums out and put other people in their place. We live in a world now where national legislatures can't solve the problems of the world. They can't solve the problems of climate. They can't contend sufficiently with the power of these globe-spanning corporations. And for me, as I imagine what the future of democracy should look like, there should be a form of international governance. And John, to take on your most challenging point, maybe that form of international governance could even extend to other species other than the human species. There should be something of that sort. But actually putting something like that in place and getting people to believe that their interests are being taken care of, I'm not sure how to accomplish that. If I look at experiments in the world that can lead us in that direction, the most promising experiment by far is the European Union, because this is a transnational institution that downplays the significance of the nation state and tries to substitute for it a more international form of cooperation. But I think it was you, John, who said, or was it Marco? I can't no longer remember, that 10% of young people voted in the most recent EU elections. The EU does not inspire the belief that the people of Europe are sovereign. In the EU, there are profound critiques of the EU bureaucracy substituting for democracy. In a world, in a future that I'm trying to imagine, I would like to see the EU be successful, not just in terms of legislating policy, but in terms of engendering a hope for democracy that is transnational, that has an international component, and that can serve as a model for the world, and then take on the much more difficult problem. It's one thing to be transnational within European boundaries. Imagine an international government that would be transnational across the boundary that separates the global north and the global south. Imagine if something of that sort could be effected. I would like to see the EU be more successful than it has been, and then that serving as a model for expanding democratic government even further across the planet. But I see no easy way of doing that. And as I discern the resurgence of nationalism in an incredibly powerful way, what is the most important issue driving polities of the global north to the right now? It's immigration. And immigration is about who belongs in this nation and who should not be admitted. And we're seeing an extraordinary resurgence of the nationalist form. And I think we have to reckon with the power of nations and figure out once again, perhaps, how to harness them in the service of democracy. Not quite sure how to do that, but it's something that I spent a lot of time thinking about.
I hope it's okay for me to jump in. I think John might have a response, but I did want to respond because I appreciate John and Gary's interventions on this question. And I do think I'm really struck by, I think in your question, Marco, you also highlighted the technological revolution. And I think what's really difficult is that while I agree with Gary, and I think it's almost like, Gary, I feel like you kind of answered your own question of, you were interested in why is the right populist movement so much more powerful than the left? And a lot of it seems to be potentially nationalism and the hold that nationalist tendencies have on people, or the draw of nationalism, and also the fear that people have about immigration. But I think what I think is striking is two things when we talk about those issues. One is that you also, though, already have cross-cutting solidarity across countries because of technology, because of social media. And that's not to lionize, there's all sorts of issues with that as well. But I do think that there are degrees in which people have already started developing kind of forms of organization and community building through the internet. And so I guess what I'm concerned about in my thinking on democracy is that we don't, in service of democracy through kind of state policies, end up kind of destroying the potential that we have for the future to be more internationalist. If that's something, and I recognize not everybody might be committed to that, but that's something I'm committed to as a more kind of globally respectful kind of way of orienting ourselves. And so I think that that's one thing that we kind of already see people developing from the bottom up, these types of connections, these types of movements, people trying to influence states' policies through protests, through international solidarity. But then also the issue with around immigration and nationalism is again also kind of related to technology, which is that my understanding, there's some evidence that a lot of times when communities have a lot of xenophobic kind of sentiments within them, it's among people who are near, let's say, a city, and that it's communities who are not actually interacting with people from other countries who are coming, but they're just sort of hearing or they're seeing on the news, oh, there's these crimes or these controversies or these tensions. And then that kind of creates it and helps inflame some of that nationalist and more xenophobic sentiment. And so that is a situation where people are more like spectators. They're kind of watching on the sidelines, but they are not actually encountering each other. And that is something that is, again, kind of technologically mediated. I don't think it's something we should naturalize too much, the way that we develop our understanding of who is a member of this nation, to what degree national identity and patriotism becomes conflated with ethno-nationalism. I think that these are things that are, again, kind of shaped by politics, and also by technologies and by social dynamics that I think we might be able to look at for potentially kind of pushing back and enabling democracy without that kind of marriage of democracy and nationalism.
2 points. On the question of the nation and nationalism, I very much agree with Kristen about the need to avoid the naturalization of these categories of nation. I'm less sanguine, much tougher, I think, than Gary on the history of that dalliance between the spirit and substance of democracy as, people power on the one hand and bounded territoriality and nationhood on the other. Nationalism was a chronic problem of that period, and the low point was the 1920s and 1930s. You didn't mention war. I mean, most of the experiments with bounded territorial national democracy after Versailles, most of them failed. And the collapse of national democracies with free and fair elections, resulted, as we know, in a second global war. And fascism was part of that story. So I'm much tougher on that dalliance between the nation and democracy, and for all kinds of other reasons. The problem with nation thinking, so to say, as Camus said, is that, I love my nation too much to be a nationalist. The problem with state-centered projects of nationalization is that there is a kind of homogenization, a xenophobia, a racism, and so on that's inevitably part of it. And I would also say that the history, when a good history of the nation and democracy and states is written, it will be much less happy than you presented. You could not say, in the case of Latin America or in Africa, that the experiment with national liberation and the independence of states committed to some kind of democracy, power sharing, it wasn't a happy story. One last comment to Gary. You are right that it's the deficits of international governing arrangements that is having crippling effects on the spirit and substance of democracy. This is not an anti-American remark, but I would remind you that, American scholars and politicians don't like to think about the United States as an empire, and they don't, therefore, enough, in my view, look at the way in which the post-45 world order, which was heavily structured by the United States with a whole set of governing institutions, is crumbling. And it's crumbling under the force of the militarization of this empire. I mean, it's another story, but we have an America which is now constantly at war. And it's having very damaging effects on the belief in democracy. And never mind the functioning of democracy. It's an empire in decline, it seems to me, that is losing every war. It hasn't won a war since 1945, a stalemate in Korea, every other war, and it will lose in Ukraine, and it will lose in the Eastern Mediterranean. But this is another story. And one last comment about international governing arrangements. Paradoxically, it is led by China. We're witnessing the growth of a whole new set of cross-border governing arrangements, some of which, paradoxically, have democratic potential, and they are not American-led. I'm thinking of BRICS. You know, the fact that BRICS brought a case against Israel to the International Court of Justice, and a preliminary ruling was handed down, is very symptomatic, I think, of our times. In the China book that I've just published, I point out that what the Chinese are doing is they are the principal force for building cross-border governing arrangements that are an alternative to the so-called American-led rules-based order. Whether we like it or not, we should study that dynamic because it has serious implications for the future of democracy. If I may, just briefly to Kristen, I liked very much your comments about the importance of the mediation of power, politics, and democracy. And I've tried to write about this. We lack a very good book on this subject. Think of it in this way. The ancient Greek democracies were the principal medium of communication was orality. You know, the spoken word, the appearance of men aged 20 or so, appearing in public and speaking and interacting without television or radio or newspapers. A second phase of democracy, the phase that I think Benedict Anderson wrote about, was the coming of the printing press, the book, the daily newspaper, the pamphlet, the novel. Democracy was reborn as representative democracy in the second half of the 18th century in an age of print communications. And interestingly, it almost was extinguished as a set of ideals and functioning institutions with the advent of mass broadcasting, of radio and television and cinema. I think, Kristen, you are absolutely right that that we are now in a period in which the main medium of communication is in which democratic sentiments and institutions are embedded is the digital, unfinished digital communications revolution. And it's a very contradictory phenomenon. Surveillance is flourishing. That is true. But it's also the case, as you rightly mentioned, Kristen, that cross-cutting social network politics, which are carriers of democratic sentiment, are actually flourishing. And it's not just Black Lives Matter and #MeToo. These are contradictory trends, but it does seem to me that there's something built in to the digital communication networks that enables resistance. Unlike the period of mass broadcasting, it's easy to copy sound, text, and image. It's easy to circulate. It's easy to set up alternative platforms. Leaks, as Julian Assange showed and wrote about before his imprisonment, leaks become chronic in the age of what I call monitory democracy, democracia monitorizada.
Mi pregunta, provocación final es ¿Cómo cerramos optimista esta sesión ante la evidencia de la popularidad, no solo en Estados Unidos, sino en muchos lados más, de esta tendencia a reemplazar la democracia con la dirección de un hombre fuerte? ¿Cómo somos optimistas en ese contexto?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking. I mean, it's hard to stay positive when you feel anxious about the potential. Gary, you said that the democratic urge is irrepressible. And I think to some degree, no matter what we are anxious about in the future, I think what should be hopeful is that in a place like the United States, our institutions are actually relatively established and also relatively resilient. And even with kind of this demagogic threat and the populist threat, I think there are spaces and capacities, I think abilities with both formally within state governments, local governments, but also within the people themselves, within the communities themselves, that people can still push back and resist and allow for self government and democratic approaches to thrive. And I think the beauty of a democracy is hopefully the idea that there are peaceful transitions of power and the idea that losers can win again. And so I guess I find that to be something that we should think about and be ready for, and find as a way of having hope in an anxious time.
I'm trying to find optimism at what is a very difficult time in the United States and in the world. As much as I would like to share Kristen's and John's optimism about what the digital revolution offers for democracy, I think on balance, so far, it's had a negative rather than a positive effect. And one of the manifestations of that is that the right is outstripping the left in world politics right now. And to be clear, John, I'm not trying to valorize nationalism as a good unto itself. My point is that what is it that gets people really motivated, excited, and successful in democratic movements? And historically, that has been the nation, the dream of a people being sovereign. I would love to have a world of democracy in which there are no nations. And I think that's something we probably share. But I'm not sure that we have found the alternative mechanism. I love your metaphor about democracy as a form of punk. But punk is also compatible with another form of resistance, which I associate more with peasant uprisings in medieval times. Outbursts, incredibly creative and consequential in the moment, but not having lasting, enduring institutional consequence. So the peasants rise up, they temporarily corral their overlords, more bread is released from the storehouses, and then power relations resume. So my emphasis on nations is not because I want to see a world of nations fighting each other. And I understand that nationalism has caused terrible wars. My focus on nations is to find an alternative form of association and affiliation that can command the deepest democratic commitments of people and allow people to make sacrifices on the behalf of democracy that nations have been able to command. And I'm not sure we have seen that form in the world as yet. As to your point about the effect of America on the world, I write against American exceptionalism. I think that America may be joining the hemisphere in the sense of democracy being fragile, being broken, a strong man, a dictator coming to power, ending democracy as the country has known it. Once your democracy has been taken away, How do you regain it? And this, we may be entering a period where America has much more to learn. Not America, the United States has much more to learn from the Americas than being a source of instruction about how to conduct democratic forms. We are in a moment of profound change, not only internally in nations, but internationally as well. I come back to one of your first points, John, which I share entirely, which is the power of China. And there are interesting democratic potentials in BRIC, but there's also the reality of a very powerful country for whom the only remnants of communism is its Leninism and not the socialist utopianism that was once part of the revolutionary promise. And I'm not sure a world governed by a Chinese empire will be superior to the one we now have. My optimism is in the optimism, to draw on Gramsci, the optimism of the will in very difficult and disconcerting times. And what we must not lose is a deep faith in democratic futures, even at a moment when it's hard to sustain that faith.
Thanks.
Well, may I? Certainly not the last word, but thank you both to Kristen and to Gary. I have a few things to say about the pessimism-optimism problem. My problem with pessimists and optimists is that they're dogmatists. You know, the pessimist is someone who knows that everything is becoming shit and will not get any better. I think it was Oscar Wilde who said that the pessimist is someone who, when opportunity knocks at the door, thinks that it's an intruder. It's like, and the optimist, curiously, is part of the same field of presumption. You know, the optimist is someone who, despite everything, is persuaded that actually the future will be better than the present. And I think the setting aside of the pessimism, optimism, dualism is very important, and it leaves hope. I think Kristen was the first to put that little four-letter word on the table. And hope is not wishful thinking. I mean, it's a long discussion about the history of this word and in various languages, but hope is not wishful thinking. Hope is the sense, the expectation that things can be made better given existing resources in this particular context. And on the irrepressibility of the democratic spirit, I think it's a very important point that both of you have made. The historian in me, likes to periodize this presumption or this expectation. And it was in the 1940s when democracy was on its knees. Only 11 electoral democracies were left on the face of the earth in 1941. It was in the 1940s that the last great discussion about the future of democracy took place. We have no good study of it. What is interesting about that, I've written a bit about it, is the consensus from left to right of the political spectrum that democracy needed reimagining, that it is more than free and fair elections and cannot be reduced to so-called free and fair elections because they could give rise to Hitlers. And that democracy, in order to survive, needed to be reimagined so that it came to be seen, or it should be seen, as the weapon that humans have to deal with abuse of power. And it was George Orwell on the left, through to Catholic conservatives on the right in that period, who made that argument. And I mentioned C.S. Lewis, a Catholic writer. The great danger of that period and of our times, I would add, is the evils of abusive power that comes in concentrated form. So here's a twist to this irrepressibility of democracy idea. We are living in a period where concentrated power in centralized form is multiplying, and war machines are an instance, and they can bring catastrophic consequences to people and the biomes in which they dwell. Our misfortune in these years of the 21st century is that once upon a time it was believed that the deities or a god would intervene to prevent the abuse of power by arrogant, hubristic people. Our misfortune is that we can't rely on the deities as the Athenians did. It wasn't a secular. We can't rely on the deities, and we can't necessarily rely on a god. And that leaves humans faced with the need to actually deal with abuse of power. And I cannot think, maybe this is a failure of my imagination, but I cannot think of any other ideal. I can't think of any other spirit or substantial, institutional forms than democracy for dealing with abuse of power. And one last remark, if I may, to Gary about right and left. In the spring of 1989, I wrote a piece that was a preface to a book by Norberto Bobbio, the great Italian Democrat and writer, in which I pondered the history of the meaning of left and right. And my point was that if you look at the origins, the genealogy of the left-right division, the French Revolution, that in the course of the next century and a half, that distinction had become utterly muddled and contaminated. The right becoming instead of preserving tradition, the right, fascist right, becoming the great believer in technological leaps forward and so on. And my proposal was that in that year, fateful year of 1989, that it's time to reimagine the left-right division. It's important that polities have a left-right division to remind them and people that they are broken, that there is not a common agreement about matters. But the proposal I put is that to be on the left is actually it's an ecumenical understanding. To be on the left is to be suspicious of and opposed to concentrated arbitrary power. And to be on the right is to be blasé about concentrated arbitrary power. Well, this reimagining of the distinction, it seems to me, in practice, functions. But this would be my view that the right is outflanking the left. I mean, I think that's French revolutionary thinking, and I think that it's important to pay attention to what it means to be on the left. And what I tried to come up with was a much more ecumenical understanding of what it is to be on the left. To be on the left is to be opposed to neoliberalism. It's opposition to concentrated wealth and all the things that you spoke about, Gary. But it's also against racist discrimination, and it is against the uncontrolled exploitation of the biomes in which we dwell. This is a whole new meaning that's required, it seems to me, of being on the left. And to be on the left is to be hopeful that actually democracy is the only weapon we have. It's almost Churchill. It's the only weapon we have left to deal with the bastards. And so if you don't accept that principle, to repeat, then you have to believe in good kings and queens. You have to believe in the Putins and, the MBSs of this world. And I wish you luck.
Pues el tiempo se nos agotó. Muchísimas gracias a los tres. Ha sido un placer enorme escucharlos, conversar. Mil gracias por haber estado acá.